Laurie Berrie and I'm based at the University of Leeds in the UK, and I'm excited to talk about our paper, The Association Between Childhood Leukemia and Population Mixing, an artefact of focusing on clusters. Ultimately, this paper is about the population mixing hypothesis, and specifically whether there is an association between population mixing and childhood leukemia. There is a disagreement in the literature which appears to depend on the analytical approach used, and we wanted to find out if one or both of the approaches introduces bias. The population mixing hypothesis proposes that children living in more isolated areas with lower population densities have less exposure to infectious diseases, such that if they are exposed later by, for example, an influx of migrants, they are more prone to a harmful immune response and ultimately leukemia. That said, no individual agent has ever been identified. We were interested in the extent of bias introduced by the two methods, and since that can never be known in the real world, we used simulated data. Our simulations were informed by real data that had been used in a previous study, but crucially, we made it so that there was no causal effect of population density and the proportion of inward migration on the occurrence of childhood leukemia. We then simply analysed the simulated data using the two approaches to see whether the results were consistent with what had been simulated. The first method, which was more common in some of the earlier studies, involved identifying areas with low population density, high inward migration and/or high leukemia incidence, and compared the incidence with the expected average for the area. The second method, which has appeared more recently, modelled the relationship between leukemia and either population density or inward migration across the whole region. We found that we got different results depending on which method we used. When we modelled the data across the whole region, we found what we expected. We simulated no causal effect, and we found no causal effect. However, when we used the other approach, i.e. selected areas for analysis based on low population density, high inward migration, and/or high leukemia incidence, we found some misleading associations. At the heart of this problem is what has been called the most dangerous equation, that small samples produce more variation. In this context, smaller areas are more likely to occasionally show extreme spikes in incidence. If you have a small population and expect to have fewer than one case, as soon as you have one or two cases, you have a much higher incidence than expected. It is then no surprise that when you combine several of these areas, they appear dramatically different to the expected regional average. We only looked at the two most common measures of population mixing, as we were more interested in the methods used to examine the association than in the technical arguments around the best measure of exposure. Also, we didn't consider how the degree of bias changes with the degree of aggregation over time. Clearly, studies combining data across many years would be less vulnerable to variation than those looking at smaller time periods. We need to reconsider the population mixing hypothesis because those studies which found associations generally use the method that we have found to be biased. In fact, when we looked at the observed data ourselves, using the whole region approach, it appeared, if anything, that higher inward migration was associated with lower risk of leukemia. More generally, any study looking at area-level exposures and rare disease outcomes need to be very careful with their selection criteria. Ideally, examine the whole region, but if that is not possible, then you need to ensure that your sample is truly representative. I hope you enjoy the paper.